Welcome to Armoria, the channel where history is not just told, it's relived. If you're fascinated by the hidden, the forgotten, and the impossible stories of war, subscribe, because here we uncover the truth behind the myths that shaped our world. Pause, ambient war drums, low brass hum. Tonight, we dive into the Second World War, but not the version you've seen in textbooks. These are the stories that seem like fiction. Soldiers who fought for 3 different nations, actors who became spies, cats that refused to die, and even battles fought alongside sworn enemies. Each one sounds impossible, yet every single detail is real. Because sometimes reality is far stranger than imagination. So sit back, soldier, and prepare to question everything you thought you knew about World War II. In the chaos of the 20th century's greatest conflict, one man lived what could only be described as the most improbable odyssey of the war. His name was Yang Kyung-jong, a young Korean whose fate was tossed around by empires like a pawn on a global chessboard. Born under Japanese occupation, Yang was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1938, not by choice, but by decree. He was sent to fight against the Soviet Union in the brutal clashes of the Khalkhin Gol campaign, an obscure but deadly border war in the Mongolian desert. When the Soviets triumphed, Yang was captured and shipped to a gulag thousands of miles from home. There he faced starvation, cold and exhaustion, until the Red Army, desperate for manpower, decided to recycle its prisoners. By 1942, he was wearing a Soviet uniform, now fighting on the Eastern Front against Nazi Germany, a war he had no stake in, for a country that was never his own. Fate twisted again in 1943. During the Battle of Kharkov, Yang was captured by the Germans. Instead of executing him, they pressed him into the Wehrmacht, the very army he'd been shooting at days earlier. Now under a new flag, he was sent west to defend the Atlantic Wall in Normandy, unaware that destiny was about to come full circle. On June 6, 1944, as the Allies stormed the beaches, Yang was captured for the 4th time, this time by American paratroopers. Imagine their confusion. A soldier in a German uniform speaking no German, no English, no Russian, only Korean. At first they thought he was Japanese, then perhaps Chinese. Eventually, translators pieced together the impossible truth. Yang Kyung-jong had fought unwillingly for 3 different nations on 3 different fronts under 3 different flags, and survived them all. The Americans sent him to a POW camp in England, where he lived quietly until the war's end. After 1945, he reportedly emigrated to the United States, disappearing into civilian life, a ghost of history walking among ordinary men. To this day, historians debate the full details of his story. But one thing remains undeniable. In a war that devoured millions of lives, Yang Kyung-jong was not just a survivor. He was an impossibility made flesh. In the middle of World War II, while Europe burned and cities crumbled under bombs, a group of men sailed toward the most desolate place on Earth, Antarctica. Their mission was so improbable that even those who took part in it later struggled to believe it had truly happened. It was called Operation Tabarin, and it was one of the strangest operations of the entire war. By 1943, the Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard. German U-boats prowled the sea, sinking British ships with terrifying efficiency. Rumors began to circulate through intelligence circles that the Nazis were preparing something extraordinary, the establishment of secret bases in the Antarctic, far beyond the reach of Allied patrols. Some dismissed it as paranoia, others saw it as a threat worth confronting. The British government decided it could not take the chance. Under the guise of scientific research, a small expedition was assembled. Officially, their goal was to collect weather data and conduct geological studies. In reality, they were to plant the Union Jack on the last unclaimed corner of the planet, securing it before Hitler's forces could. The men chosen were scientists, sailors, and officers who had never set foot on ice before. None of them could have imagined what awaited them. They departed from the Falkland Islands aboard a modest vessel, battling violent seas and the kind of cold that steals a man's breath. The voyage south was endless. Icebergs loomed like floating fortresses, and the ship's hull groaned under the crushing weight of frozen water. When at last they reached the Antarctic peninsula, the crew realized they were utterly alone, a handful of men standing at the edge of the world. There, amid blizzards and silence, they began their work. They hacked through ice with pickaxes and built wooden huts that creaked in the wind. They raised a British flag that barely fluttered in the frozen air. Their first outpost was named Port Lockroy. It became a strange blend of science station and military post, a lonely mark of human presence surrounded by nothing but snow, rock, and penguins. The men endured isolation that gnawed at their sanity. Weeks passed without sunlight. The winds screamed like a living thing. Radios crackled with ghostly signals, some of them in languages they didn't understand. Several swore they saw unmarked planes crossing the horizon, metallic flashes that vanished into the white sky. Were they imagining things, or were the Germans truly there, somewhere beyond the mist? At night, they heard distant sounds, engines perhaps, or the echo of shifting ice. The Antarctic landscape could play tricks on the mind, bending sound and distance until nothing felt real. Yet deep down, each man knew that this operation was not only about science or maps. It was about control, about ensuring that even at the ends of the earth the enemy would find no refuge. Months turned into a year. The outposts they built were battered but stood firm. They gathered weather data, mapped coastlines, and quietly sent coded reports back to London. The British presence in Antarctica was now permanent. When the war finally ended, Operation Tabarin was officially declared a success, though few ever learned it had existed at all. For decades, the mission remained classified. When the files were eventually declassified, the world discovered a story that bordered on absurdity. In the middle of the bloodiest war in human history, men had risked their lives not on the front lines, but among glaciers and penguins, to defend a continent no one truly understood. The bases built during the mission would later become the foundation of the British Antarctic Survey, the organization that still operates there today. The men of Tabarin returned home changed forever, weathered, silent, and haunted by memories of the endless white void. Even now, legends cling to their story. Some claim that German submarines really did reach the South Pole. Others whisper of hidden tunnels beneath the ice. Myths grew from the silence they left behind. But the truth is strange enough. In a war that spanned every continent, humanity's hunger for control reached even the coldest place on Earth. Operation Tabarin remains one of the most surreal chapters of the Second World War. A reminder that even in a conflict defined by fire and steel, there were battles fought with frost, fear, and isolation. It was a war without gunfire, where the enemy was not another man but the planet itself. And somehow, against the endless cold, those men won. War has never been a place for tenderness. It devours everything, men, cities, innocence, and leaves behind only silence. Yet in the middle of the most destructive conflict in human history, one small creature managed to cheat death over and over again, crossing enemy lines and surviving the sinking of 3 warships. His name was Unsinkable Sam, and his story is one of the strangest legends ever born from the sea. It began aboard the German battleship Bismarck, the pride of the Kriegsmarine. In May of 1941, the ship set sail on its first and only mission, to hunt Allied convoys in the Atlantic. On board, among thousands of sailors, was a black and white cat, a simple mascot adopted by the crew. To the men, he was a sign of home, a reminder of peace in a world that had forgotten it. They called him Oscar. On May 27th, the Bismarck was cornered by the British fleet and annihilated after a relentless pursuit. The ship burned, twisted, and sank beneath the waves, taking more than 2,000 men with it. Hours later, as British sailors searched the wreckage for survivors, they found a strange sight: a soaked, trembling cat floating on a piece of wood. They pulled him aboard the destroyer HMS Cossack, unaware they had just rescued the most indestructible passenger of the war. The crew dried him, fed him, and gave him a new name: Sam. He adjusted quickly to his new home, strolling the decks of his British ship as if he had always belonged there. To the superstitious sailors, he became a lucky charm. Wherever the Cossack went, Sam went too, a silent observer amid the thunder of war. For months, the ship escorted convoys through freezing Atlantic waters, dodging torpedoes and air raids. The men believed that as long as Sam was on board, they would live to see another dawn. But luck in war is a cruel companion. In October 1941, while escorting a convoy near Gibraltar, the Cossack was struck by a German torpedo. The explosion ripped through the hull, killing dozens instantly. The survivors clung to debris as the ship broke apart. Once again, when rescuers arrived, they found Sam floating calmly on a plank, covered in oil but alive. He had survived a second shipwreck. 2 nations, 2 ships, 2 near deaths. The Royal Navy officers, half in awe and half in disbelief, decided the cat had earned a place of honor. They renamed him Unsinkable Sam and transferred him to a new ship, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. Ironically, it was the very same vessel that had helped sink the Bismarck, his first home. The war had a strange sense of irony, a German cat now sailing with the British on the ship that destroyed his past. Life aboard the Ark Royal was different. The crew adored him. He roamed the corridors, inspected sailors during roll call, and dozed beside the carrier's massive guns. He had no idea he was now part of one of the Royal Navy's most powerful ships. But the ocean, as always, was waiting. On November 14, 1941, while returning from an operation near Malta, a German U-boat fired a torpedo that struck the Ark Royal. The explosion echoed across the sea. The ship began to tilt, taking on water rapidly. Panic spread. Sailors rushed to lifeboats as the engines died, and the great carrier began to sink. Hours later, as rescue ships combed the waves, someone spotted movement among the debris. It was Sam, calm, alive, clinging once more to a wooden plank as the sun sank into the horizon. 3 ships, 3 disasters, 1 cat. After this final miracle, the Royal Navy decided his combat days were over. Sam was officially retired from service and brought ashore to live out his days in peace. First, he stayed in Gibraltar, where he was treated as a celebrity by sailors and officers who considered him a symbol of resilience. Later, he was taken to Belfast, where he lived quietly in a sailor's home until 1955. His story spread through the fleet like folklore. Sailors told it with a mix of awe and affection, the tale of a cat who refused to die, who crossed the sea from one side of the war to the other, surviving both German steel and British fire. To some, he was a symbol of luck, to others of endurance. In the heart of chaos, he had found a way to live again and again. Decades later, his portrait was painted and placed in the National Maritime Museum in London. It shows a small cat, black and white, with a calm expression, not heroic, not proud, just peaceful, as if he had seen too much to be impressed by life or death. Some historians debate whether all 3 sinkings truly involved the same cat. But in the end, the details don't matter. The legend of Unsinkable Sam captures something rare in war, the stubborn persistence of life, the quiet defiance of something innocent against the machinery of destruction. While men killed and died for empires, one small creature simply endured. He did not choose sides and he did not care for flags. He only survived, and in doing so, reminded everyone around him that even in war, miracles sometimes float. Before the world knew his voice, before the black cape of Dracula or the white robes of Saruman, Christopher Lee walked through the ruins of Europe as a soldier, a spy, and a witness to the darkest truths of war. His legend in cinema was only the echo of something far greater, a reality that no script could capture. He was born in 1922 into a family that carried both nobility and the weight of old wars. His father was a decorated military man, his mother descended from Italian aristocracy. When the Second World War erupted, Lee was barely 17, restless and determined to fight. He volunteered for the Royal Air Force, dreaming of the skies, but his eyes betrayed him. A defect in his optic nerve made flying impossible. Most men would have accepted that fate. Lee did not. He simply found another way to serve. Through connections in the Air Force intelligence branch, he was transferred into an organization that officially did not exist. Its name was never printed in newspapers, and even now much of what it did remains hidden. It was known as the Special Operations Executive, Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Its purpose was simple: sabotage, espionage, assassination. Lee fit perfectly, intelligent, disciplined, and unafraid of silence. He operated across North Africa and Italy, where he helped gather intelligence and coordinate missions behind enemy lines. He was often alone, often unarmed, moving through villages where a single mistake meant death. He learned to speak quietly, to disappear into crowds, to read fear in other men's eyes. Years later, when journalists asked what exactly he did, Lee only smiled and said, "Can you keep a secret? So can I." In 1943, as the Allies fought their way up the Italian peninsula, Lee worked alongside commandos to track German troop movements and dismantle communication networks. His reports guided bombing raids and troop advances. He interrogated captured officers, piecing together fragments of information that might save lives the next day. Those who served with him said he never flinched, never raised his voice, and never forgot a single face. Behind his composure was something cold and resolute. Not cruelty, but understanding of what war demanded from men who wished to survive it. When Germany collapsed in 1945, Lee's war was not over. He was reassigned to the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, an Allied task force hunting the remnants of the SS. He walked through towns reduced to rubble, through the gates of camps where the smell of death still lingered. He saw things no actor could ever unsee. Later, when he spoke of that time, his words carried the weight of someone who had stared directly into the pit of human cruelty. "When you've seen what I've seen," he once said, "you stop being afraid of anything." It was during this period that his reputation for calm intensity began to form. He tracked down escaped officers, interrogated collaborators, and witnessed the aftermath of the crimes that would later be judged at Nuremberg. He saw evil not as fantasy, but as something ordinary, bureaucratic, polite, and terrifying in its normality. When he finally returned to England, he was only 24 years old, but he had lived 100 lives. He didn't plan to become an actor. The war had left him hollow, searching for something that could make sense of the chaos he had survived. A friend introduced him to a film company, and his height, presence, and voice earned him a small role. It was the beginning of a career that would span nearly 7 decades. But every time he played a monster or a tyrant, there was truth behind his eyes. A quiet knowledge that the darkness he portrayed was real. Years later, on the set of The Lord of the Rings, director Peter Jackson tried to explain to him how to act during a stabbing scene. Lee interrupted softly and said, "Peter, have you ever heard the sound a man makes when he's stabbed in the back?" Jackson hesitated. "No." Lee answered, "Well, I have." And that was all. The conversation ended there. He didn't have to act. He was remembering. Throughout his career, he rarely spoke about his service. He said that war was something a man carried in silence, not in stories. Even when he was knighted, he avoided talking about medals or missions. What mattered to him was duty and the memory of those who did not return. When he died in 2015, many remembered him as an icon of horror and fantasy. But the truth is that Christopher Lee's greatest role was never filmed. It was lived in the shadows of occupied Europe, in the wreckage of civilization, and in the quiet moments after victory, when he stood among the ruins and tried to believe the world could still recover. He spent his life performing darkness on screen because he had already faced it in reality. His characters, proud, tragic, powerful, were shaped by that experience. When he stared into the camera, audiences felt something more than acting. They felt authenticity. Behind the villain's voice was a man who had hunted real monsters, and that is why Christopher Lee never needed to pretend to be dangerous. He already knew what danger looked like. In the final days of World War II, when the world had already decided who had won and who had lost, one last battle erupted, not for territory, not for glory, but for the survival of a handful of men trapped inside a medieval fortress. It was the only time in the entire war that Americans and Germans fought side by side, united against a common enemy. The place was Castle Itter, hidden deep in the Austrian Alps, and what happened there defied every rule of war. By May of 1945, Hitler was dead, Berlin was burning, and the Third Reich was collapsing into chaos. But far from the ruined cities, among green valleys and snow-covered peaks, the SS still fought with blind fanaticism. Castle Itter had been turned into a special prison for the Nazis' most valuable captives, famous French politicians, generals, and intellectuals. Inside its stone walls were men like Paul Reynaud, former Prime Minister of France, General Maxime Weygand, and Jean Borotra, the tennis champion of Wimbledon. The SS had kept them alive for years as bargaining chips, but as Germany fell, those same guards prepared to execute them. On May 4th, the castle's commandant fled, leaving the prisoners behind. For a moment there was silence, and then panic. The prisoners knew that a unit of SS troops was advancing toward them, determined to erase all evidence of the prison before the Allies arrived. Desperate, they searched the armory and armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find, a few rifles, some pistols, and courage born from despair. But they were alone. Outside, the SS numbered in the hundreds. They needed help. They sent a single messenger, a cook named Andreas Krobot, through the mountains to find Allied troops. Somehow, through enemy lines and chaos, he found an American patrol from the 23rd Tank Battalion, led by Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr. When Krobot told him about the French VIPs trapped in the castle, Lee didn't hesitate. He gathered a handful of men, one Sherman tank, and prepared to fight his way to the fortress. But the path to Itter was swarming with retreating German forces. That's when fate intervened. Along the way, Lee encountered a German officer, Major Joseph Gangl, who had already surrendered to the Americans. Gangl despised the SS and refused to let his homeland be destroyed by their madness. When he heard what was happening at the castle, he made a decision that would define his life. "We'll fight with you," he said. And so, enemies became allies. Together, a small convoy of Americans and Wehrmacht soldiers moved toward the castle. The crew of Lee's tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, led the way, followed by a few trucks carrying German infantry. When they arrived, the French prisoners were stunned. American GIs and German soldiers working side by side, laughing nervously, preparing for battle together. For the first time, the lines of the war blurred completely. At dawn on May 5th, the SS attacked. They came from the forest and the hills, shouting, firing mortars and machine guns at the old stone walls. The defenders fired back from the castle towers, their ammunition running low. The Sherman tank roared until it was destroyed by an anti-tank gun, leaving only its smoking carcass in the courtyard. Inside, chaos reigned. Americans and Germans fought shoulder to shoulder, defending stairwells and windows, reloading for one another in a storm of bullets. The French prisoners refused to hide. Some took up arms themselves. Jean Borotra, the tennis legend, volunteered to climb over the castle wall and run through enemy lines to find reinforcements. He sprinted across open ground, dodging fire, and somehow made it to an American unit several miles away. Hours later, reinforcements arrived, just as the defenders were preparing for their final stand. When the shooting stopped, the castle still stood. The SS retreated, leaving behind dozens of dead. Inside the fortress, the Americans, Germans, and French prisoners looked at each other in disbelief. They had survived, but their victory carried a cost. Major Joseph Gangl, the German officer who had chosen honor over loyalty to Hitler, was killed by a sniper while protecting one of the French prisoners. He died fighting side by side with the men he had once been ordered to kill. The Battle of Castle Itter was over in a single day, but its meaning lasted far longer. It was the last battle of the war in Europe, and perhaps the only one fought entirely for decency. There was no strategy, no orders from above, just men who chose to do the right thing when everything else had fallen apart. After the war, Castle Itter became a symbol of reconciliation. Captain Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The French survivors returned home, forever marked by the memory of the Germans who had saved them. And in the small Austrian village below the castle, The name Joseph Gangle is still remembered with honor. He was a Nazi officer by uniform, but a human being by choice. Today, the castle still stands, weathered and silent. The walls bear scars from bullets that fell 8 decades ago. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes, the shouts in 2 languages, the gunfire, the strange alliance forged in the final hours of chaos. It was a battle that made no sense, yet embodied everything that war should have been about: courage, compassion, and the refusal to surrender to hatred. The Battle of Castle Itter remains one of the most extraordinary moments in military history, the day when enemies fought together, and for a brief, impossible moment, humanity won. War creates stories that no imagination could invent. Yet every one of these, the soldier who fought for 3 armies, the explorers who built a base among penguins, the cat that refused to drown, the spy who became a legend, and the enemies who fought side by side, actually happened. These moments reveal something deeper than strategy or victory. They show how, even in humanity's darkest hour, life refused to yield. A frightened man survived 3 empires. Sailors rescued a cat from the wreckage of hell. An actor faced real monsters before pretending to be one. Soldiers put aside hatred for one final act of decency. History is often told through numbers, millions lost, cities destroyed. But the soul of it lives in stories like these, where courage and absurdity meet. They prove that even in chaos there is still meaning. Even in death there can be mercy. The Second World War was a storm that nearly erased civilization, yet within it, small sparks of humanity endured. These stories remind us that truth can be stranger than fiction and far more powerful. Because when the world collapses and everything human seems lost, something within us still refuses to surrender. And in that defiance, quiet, imperfect, miraculous, humanity wins again.